Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at these planned talks between Russia and Ukraine and Turkey. There was a lot of buzz initially, wasn't there, about maybe Zelensky and Putin actually meeting face-to-face, a potential real shift.
That's right. But now, well, it seems pretty unlikely Putin himself will be there.
Which is interesting considering we haven't seen any direct talks at that level since, the full invasion started back in early 22.
Exactly. So our mission here is to kind of unpack the significance of these talks, even without Putin, and figure out what's really on the table.
Okay, so how did we even get here? These talks in Turkey, where did the idea come from? It sounds like European allies played a part.
Yeah, it looks like the main push came from some of Ukraine's key partners in Europe, Germany, France, Poland, the UK. They apparently gave Russia a pretty stark choice. Agree to a 30-day ceasefire, basically, or face a whole new wave of sanctions. Really tough ones.
Okay, and Putin's reaction wasn't just, sure, let's pause the fighting.
No, not quite. Instead, he turned around and proposed direct negotiations. Russia and Ukraine talking directly. Now you could look at that and think, okay, diplomacy. But it's also possible, maybe even likely, this was a classic Russian move to buy time.
But delaying tactic. Stall, maybe hope the immediate threat of sanctions fades a bit.
Could be. We've seen that sort of thing before, right? Offers to talk when things maybe aren't going so well militarily or to ease international pressure.
But it sounds like maybe this time it didn't quite go according to plan for him.
It seems that way. Initially, Kyiv and the European capitals were saying, look, no talks without a ceasefire first. But then that stance seemed to soften a bit. And that change happened, interestingly, after President Trump publicly urged Zelensky to go ahead and talk immediately.
There was even some chatter, wasn't there, about Trump maybe getting involved himself, though that seems off the table now.
Yeah, speculation, but it looks unlikely now.
So Putin maybe just wanted to look like he was negotiating, but Zelensky, calling his bluff, maybe even suggesting a personal meeting, changed the game. This is where it gets really fascinating. Why wouldn't Putin show up? What's the strategy there?
Well, there could be a few reasons. First, think about the optics. If Putin sits down with Zelensky, that kind of undermines his whole narrative, the one he's pushed for so long, trying to delegitimize Ukraine's government.
Right. By not being there, he avoids that picture, that direct acknowledgement of Zelensky as an equal leader in a negotiation.
Exactly. Keeps that distance, reinforces his message back home.
Okay, what else?
Secondly, and maybe ironically, by not going, he might actually hand Zelensky a bit of a PR win.
How so?
Zelensky can now point to Putin's empty chair and say, see, Russia isn't serious about peace. That message plays well internationally.
Interesting. So, okay, let's assume some kind of serious discussion happens, even without Putin. What could they actually talk about? Their goals seem miles apart.
Oh, completely. President Zelensky's position is crystal clear. The number one priority, the absolute must-have, is an immediate, unconditional ceasefire. For Ukraine and its allies, that's the starting point. No ceasefire, no real progress on anything else.
On Putin's side, they're talking about root causes. What does that actually mean in this context?
When Putin talks about root causes, he's going way back, long before 2022. He's talking about Russia's view on Ukraine's very existence as an independent state. The idea that it's historically part of Russia. And of course, the issue of NATO expansion, which Russia sees as a direct threat.
And these root causes are fundamental deal breakers for Ukraine and its allies, right? They strike at the heart of sovereignty.
Absolutely non-negotiable. They challenge Ukraine's right to exist and choose its own path. So you see the huge gap.
This isn't the first time Turkey's been the venue, is it?
Yeah.
You mentioned those talks back in spring 2022. What can we learn from that attempt?
Right. Those talks in Turkey and Belarus happened under very different conditions. That was right after Russia's initial plan to take Kyiv quickly had, failed. So Russia probably went into those talks hoping to salvage something after that big military setback.
And what was reportedly on offer from Moscow back then, I recall it wasn't exactly generous towards Ukraine.
No. Reports suggested the proposals essentially required Ukraine to give up huge chunks of its sovereignty, leaving it pretty powerless, really.
And those talks just collapsed.
Yeah.
What was the final straw?
The discoveries in places like Bucha, the evidence of widespread atrocities committed by Russian troops, that really shocked the world and, understandably, hardened Ukraine's resolve completely. Any talk of conceding sovereignty became impossible after that, morally and politically.
So fast forward to now. Putin's probably not coming. Who does Russia send instead? They won't just leave an empty seat, presumably.
The Kremlin signaled they're ready for Putin not to attend. They've mentioned sending a delegation at an expert technical level, And the likely head of that delegation, Vladimir Medinsky, the same guy who led their team back in those failed 2022 talks.
Medinsky again. That doesn't exactly scream new approach, does it?
It suggests a certain continuity, perhaps?
And you mentioned the stakes are higher now, with this threat of more sanctions.
That's right. The U.S. and European allies have made it pretty clear that if Russia doesn't engage seriously on a ceasefire this time, more severe economic pain could follow. That adds pressure.
Turkey seems keen to play the mediator here. They managed it before with the grain deal, didn't they? For a while, anyway.
They did. Turkey's been actively trying to mediate all along. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was their big success, brokering that deal for Ukraine's exports. But we also have to remember Russia pulled out of that deal last year. So these things can be fragile.
And Turkey itself is in a tricky spot, isn't it? NATO member. But Erdogan also talks about this special relationship with Putin.
Exactly. It's a complex balancing act. They have NATO obligations, but also important economic and diplomatic ties with Russia. It makes them a possible, if delicate, bridge.
We know the U.S. will have people there, too, watching. Sounds like some figures linked to the Trump administration.
Yes. Reports say President Trump's special envoy, Keith Kellogg, and his foreign envoy, Steve Witkoff, plan to be in Istanbul. Plus, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is expected to be in Turkey for NATO meetings anyway, and word is he'll observe these talks too.
So even just having people in the room face-to-face might matter, even if it's just about applying pressure or gathering intel.
It could still be significant, yes. Direct observation matters.
Okay, so let's wrap this up. We've got these talks coming up in Turkey, lots of uncertainty, especially with Putin likely staying away. The core goals of each side seem, well, fundamentally opposed. And the history of past talks isn't exactly encouraging for a quick breakthrough.
That sums it up pretty well. The issues driving this conflict are incredibly deep-seated. There are definitely no easy fixes on the horizon.
Which really leaves us, and you listening, with a big question, doesn't it? Given everything we've talked about, the history, the clashing positions, what real pathways to actually dialing down the fighting or finding some kind of resolution might even exist beyond these talks?
It certainly looks like a long, tough road ahead.